please.
All right. Hi, everyone. And I'm Tyler Lemon. I'm a grad student at UC Berkeley, and welcome to my presentation on agreement in Uab Meto. So just to start with some general background. So there are lots of different ways of agreeing in the world's languages. And among those different ways of agreeing, two of the most common are what you might call nominative, i.e. subject preference, and absolutive, i.e. object preference. Another way of putting this would be that if you have a transitive clause, agreement is preferentially either with the external argument or the internal argument. And these preferences are thought to arise either from case discrimination or variation in the location of phi probes, where external argument preference arises from a probe on T, and internal argument preference arises from a probe on V, little v, or a probe on T with case discrimination that can't agree with ergatives, for example. The common principle being that a phi probe agrees with the highest eligible argument in its C-command domain. Notably, consistent agreement with the higher arguments is almost always assumed to result from a probe on T, but I argue that this need not be the case. So my main claim today is that nominative agreement may also arise from a low phi probe on an agar head immediately above voice. And this talk will argue that Uab Meto is an example of a language with nominative agreement in which the phi probe is on an agar head below TAM and negation and immediately above voice. So just as a preview of the analysis, as I said, I argue that agreement is below TAM and negation and higher than big V, little v, and voice. This is partially because I haven't been able to find a particular head to put it on. And therefore, I propose that the phi probe is located on an agar head, where agar selects voice P as its complement and projects an agar P. So just like a phi probe on T, the phi probe on agar probes into its C-command domain and agrees with the closest DP, yielding nominative aligned agreement. Based on word order facts, a separate process then moves this DP to spec TP to the left of negation and TAM markers. And this talk will show that Uab Meto also has nom-ac alignment in its case marking. And speculatively, you could say that T assigns nominative case to the highest DP and moves it to spec TP. So the location of the phi probe on an agar head immediately above voice, how it probes, and the movement of this highest DP are shown in the tree in 1 here. Now, as for the clause structure I'm going to be assuming today, including specific functional items, that's illustrated here in 2. We'll try to zoom out to actually make it all visible. So there are different TAM elements that I'm going to focus on today. So essa, a focus marker, he, an irrealis marker, lo, which means must, lof, which marks future tense, and which marks inceptive aspect, ka, fa for negation, and bisa, which means can. These are all above agreement, but I'll show that bisa is the lowest, being the only one that occurs below negation. There are also some verbal affixes that attach to verb roots, stative ma, and 2 suffixes ba and glottal stop that transitivize or causativize verbs. And in following sections, I will justify the placement of agar in this specific location in the hierarchy. Okay. So before delving into some data, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about Uab Meto and the different sources of data that I use and also the transcription that I use. So Uab Meto, also known as Bahasa Dawan, is in the Timoric branch, and it's spoken in the western third of the island of Timor in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. It has roughly 700,000 speakers, according to Ethnologue, though there appears to be growing shift to Indonesian. There are many varieties of Uab Meto, as shown in this figure. So this is all within the Uab Meto zone, but these are the different varieties that have been identified by speakers. Most of the data that I draw on today comes from primary fieldwork with speakers of the Mio-Mafo variety, or from earlier work with speakers of that same variety by Arca and Steinhauer. Data from Edwards 2020 and other work by Edwards cited here comes from the Kotos Amarasi variety. Edwards has also inspired the 2-vowel analysis of many lexical roots and also the glosses of many functional items. As for the orthography used here, it's mostly what you'd expect with a few exceptions. So glottal stop is represented with an apostrophe. This is important because it occurs all over the place. And ja/ja is represented with the letter J. Also, to distinguish different levels of mid-vowels, high mid-vowels are represented with accent marks on them, and low mid-vowels lack the accent mark. Occasionally, I also adjust sources examples to maintain a consistent orthography and glossing. Okay. So now on to the actual data. So first, the basics, the paradigms. So Uab Meto has 2 sets of subject agreement prefixes, an asyllabic set without vowels, and a syllabic set with vowels. That's shown in this part of Table 1. The choice between the two is largely conditioned by phonology and morphology, with some lexical variation. It's pretty complicated. Personal pronouns show a case distinction between nominative and accusative. In general, the first and second person accusatives have K, and the nominatives have H, except for first singular. Third person is kind of doing its own thing. Many of these pronouns also have distinct metathesized and unmetathesized forms, where in general the use of one versus the other of metathesized or unmetathesized is conditioned by the phonological environment. I'll also point out that the nominatives are also used for possession, which you might see in a few examples, and only personal pronouns have case distinctions. Lastly, the third person singular accusative enclitic e has considerable allomorphy, so you'll see different forms e, je, le, and be, which depend on the final segment of the stem, but I just want to point out that all of those represent the same thing. Okay, now with that established, I'll go on to establishing the alignment. So as you might guess based on the title of my talk, Uab Meto agreement exhibits nominative accusative alignment in its pronouns and its verbal agreement prefixes. So first I'll show some simple one verb sentences. So if you look in 3, here's an intransitive verb with a patient subject, fall. Here's an intransitive verb with an agent subject, run. And they both use nominative subjects and you get agreement with them. If you look in 4, we have a monotransitive verb, kick. And in both cases, whether the subject's first person or third person, you have agreement with the subject. And notably, this subject form here is identical to the subject form used for the subject of an intransitive verb. And you see the same thing with ditransitives, where you still have nominative subjects and you have agreement with that nominative subject and not either of the objects. So just to illustrate the analysis, the proposed structure of 5b, they gave me some corn, is provided in 6 here. So I'm assuming that agar agrees with the highest argument, the subject, generating spec voice P. The verbal complex is assembled with head movements to agar, and ultimately the subject moves to spec TP, with the other arguments staying in C2. Okay, so those are the basics. Now on to establishing where agreement is in the clausal spine. So first, agreement is below TAM and negation. So the case and agreement patterns that you saw in 3 through 5 above look quite typical for a language with nominative accusative alignment. The data in 3 through 5 are consistent with an analysis where T assigns a nominative case as responsible for subject agreement, like English, but additional data suggests that the probe is on a head lower than T. In fact, it's lower than negation and TAM elements in general. So here's some evidence to show that. Importantly, agreement only occurs on lexical verbs. And this agreement occurs even in the presence of the various TAM markers in negation. So all the boys will play soccer, you still have agreement on the verb. You can drive a car, yes, I can drive a car. So BISA does not intervene for agreement. If you have must here, coming between the subject and the verb, you still get agreement. If you have negation, you still get agreement. If you have the Irialis marker, same thing. If you have this inceptive aspect marker, also same thing. So these things don't intervene. And of course, this is unlike English, where such elements block agreement from lowering onto lexical V's. So you have to say he will play soccer, not he will plays soccer, for example. Perhaps not surprisingly, topic and focus also don't interfere with agreement, where topicalized GPs are just fronted. So this dog you kick. Focus DPs are followed by the marker S or ESA, and these also have no effect on agreement that shows up on the verb. Okay, so those are different functional elements. Now, one possible objection that some people might have is that all these non-agreeing words are just adverbial elements or some other adjunct-like element that would not be expected to interfere with agreement, like, say, English quickly or still, or other adverbial things. But as you all know, one way to contrast adjuncts and clausal spine auxiliaries in English is that adjuncts don't license VP ellipsis, but auxiliaries do. So you can say like he can, if you have the right context, to mean like he can sing, where you elide the VP, but you can't say like he quickly or he still. Uab Meto displays the same contrast, where you have an auxiliary like bisa that can license ellipsis, but an adjunct like fe, which means still can't. So if you ask the question, in bisa na hanap maka ka? Can he cook rice? You can respond, in bisa, he can. But if you ask, is he still cooking rice? In fe na hanap maka ka? You cannot respond in fe. You have to at least add the verb nahan or nahana, meaning to cook, as well as potentially an object. Just kind of hammering these two words home a bit more. Bisa and fe also differ in their flexibility of placement. So when bisa co-occurs with a verb, it always has to be immediately pre-verbal. So this sentence is good, ho bisa make oto, but you can't say ho make bisa oto or ho make oto bisa. Well, actually, this one is okay as a question, but not as a declarative. Fe, however, is more flexible. It usually occurs pre-verbally, including before negation, but it can also occur in a final position. So you might be wondering, okay, why am I focusing on bisa? Well, the reason for this is, to my knowledge, it's the only auxiliary that occurs inside of negation rather than outside of negation, like he and inceptive n, for example. So ka bisa korban nesif, but he kan mu'if, we don't say they have nothing, or how kat now faben, where the inceptive occurs to the outside of the right edge of negation. So all of this shows that agreement is lower than TAM markers and negation in Uab Meto. To illustrate this analysis, a partial structure of 14a, I couldn't offer any more, is provided in 15. I'll point out now that the crucial part of the structure is the placement of agar relative to t, neg, and ox. I still don't really know the precise structure of the serial verb construction, and in fact, that's what I'm trying to tackle now. So, yeah. Okay, now, for the second half of this talk, I'll show that agreement is above big V, little v, and voice. So far, we've seen that agreement is lower than TAM markers and negation. So as you all know, though consistent subject agreement is usually thought to result from a phi probe on T, absolutive preference agreement is often thought to arise from a phi probe on little v. So one potential logical next step would be to ask, could one somehow locate the phi probe on little v in Uab Meto? There are a few arguments against this. So one line of reasoning is that agreement is always with the verb's highest argument, regardless where it comes from. So as you've all seen by now, agreement is subject aligned. And this preference holds for presumed unaccusative, unergative, monotransitive, and ditransitive verbs. So I follow Harley 2013 and Leggett 2014, among others, and assuming the external arguments are introduced in spec voice P. So regardless of whether external arguments are introduced in spec voice P or spec little vp, a probe on little v or voice would only see command an object. So with that kind of configuration, you would expect a preference for object agreement on a probe. So as further evidence for this preference for agreement with the highest DP, I'm turning now to transitivized/causativized verbs. So evidence that agreement is higher than little v. Uab Meto has two suffixes, glottal stop and ba, that I mentioned before, that transitivize verbs and allow for the expression of an agent argument. So when these suffixes are added, agreement was with a higher agent and not with the patient that's agreed with when the verb is intransitive. So here are two verbs below that demonstrate this. So take like outfayan, I return, so probably an unaccusative. You can transitivise this one with the glottal stop. You also unmetaphesize it, so you get out ufaniko, I return you, and you notice you're agreeing with the external argument here rather than the internal one. A similar example can be shown with outsae, like I rise, versus homusayab cow, you raise me. So ow and cow here are presumably both internal arguments. And when you transitivise the verb, it'll switch from agreeing with the internal argument to agreeing with the external argument. So I assume that these two suffixes are causative v heads, little v heads, in line with analyses of morphological causatives in languages like Yaqui and Achinese. So under this assumption, the agreement pattern in 16 and 17 follows if the probe is higher than v, but it's surprising otherwise. How this analysis captures the agreement pattern is illustrated below in 18 and 19, which provides structures for 17a and 17b. So this is I rise here, where I is generated as an internal argument, and it's the only argument in the C command domain of Agar, so it agrees with that, and that moves to subject position. But if you transdivise it, well, now the closest DP is an external argument, an agent, and that will be targeted for agreement instead. Okay. There's also morphological evidence that agreement is higher than big V, little v, and voice. And this primarily comes from the state of prefix ma and nominalization. So first, for evidence that agreement is higher than big V. This is a fairly transparent argument. It's just that stative ma intervenes linearly between the agreement prefix and the verb root. If the phi probe were on big V, this linear intervention would be unexpected. So here's an active sentence. Out Uab Meto, I break off this corn, but you can also staticize it. So like in aste namiup nub, its axle was broken twice. So when you use ma, the subject ends up being a more patient-like argument that's affected by the action. You can also show that agreement is higher than big V, little v, and voice through nominalizations, where of course I'm assuming that voice is higher than big V and little v. So first, evidence that agreement is higher than big V again. Verb roots don't show agreement when they're nominalized. So the simplest nominalizations suffix t to the verb root, and these indicate the result or instrument associated with the verb. So here's the verb root ken/kena in 22. So if you use it as a verb, inan ken fafjes, you have to agree. But if you nominalize it, you turn that into kenat, which means gun. You don't have any more agreement. You can keep going with this. So for evidence that agreement is higher than little v, verb roots with causative suffixes also don't show agreement when they're nominalized. So first, as some background, you can add a prefix a to something like cannot, which means gun, and you end up with a cannot, which means shooter. And if a verb stem ends with a consonant, which includes roots causativized with the two transitive suffixes, then the suffix t doesn't appear overtly in the corresponding nominalization, but agentive a still shows up, which is part of how you know it's a nominalization. So take, for example, like inantup es haletun, you nominalize that, like you get atupas, which is someone who sleeps. You can also transitivise this verb. You can say autupab ko, like I put you to sleep, like maybe something you would do with a child. And you can nominalize that as an atupab, so someone who puts to sleep. So the fact that nominalizations can include these suffixes without agreement suggests that agreement is higher than this. Finally, you can show that agreement is higher than voice. So verb roots that include state of ma also don't show agreement when they're nominalized. So I'm assuming that ma is a state of voice head. And so you can take an example like initumese esnahuinkan bin lepalei to show that this is a verb root, like give birth, that does agree when it acts as a verb. But if you have something like his birthday, you can get this mahuente here, which is like be birthedness or something like that. Or amahonit, meaning parent, or amane. Here's another example with a different root that includes both state of ma and transitive b. Okay, thanks for the time. So my tentative analysis of these nominalizations is that they're formed via head movement of big V, little v, and voice to attach to the nominalizing head the suffix t, which has the allomorphs of t, s in stems that contain a t, and nothing if you already have a consonant at the end of the stem, like say when you have one of the transitive suffixes. And this head adjunction analysis is motivated by the apparent lack of argument structure and DPs in general in nominalizations, though I wouldn't say that anything particularly crucial depends on it. Here are some example structures. So here's mahuente, or atupab with the transitive little v, or amanekab, which includes state of ma and transitive little v. And crucially, of course, there's no agar in here, so that's why it doesn't show up. You might be thinking, well, if there are no DPs in nominalizations, maybe it's just that there's nothing to agree with. Well, Against that idea is that agreement is obligatory on unnominalized verbs. So you have to say homusayab cow. You can't say hosayab cow, for example. And also in dictionary entries and elicitation contexts, you get third-person agreements attached to verbs, which is kind of representative of a morphological default. Therefore, I take the lack of agreement in nominalizations to be informative of missing structure. So I guess only when there is an agripy does agreement occur. And here is its axle is broken twice to demonstrate that even when you have like the state of ma, you need the agar present in order to get agreements in the verbal complex. And I'm pretty sure I'm out of time, so I'm going to walk through this next part in about a minute and a half. So just very quickly, I want you have a pretty good idea what my analysis of the facts is at this point. I also just want to say very quickly that there are some alternatives that you could think of that just don't fit for Uab Meto. So for example, this isn't inherent agreement with a specifier that C commands the phi probe. So for example, analyze as agreement between like say little v and its specifier or whichever head happens to introduce that argument. You can see that, for example, in something like chol. But crucially, when you have intransitive verbs, you don't get ergative agreement. And that, of course, is not how Uab Meto agreement works, because you get agreement on subjects in general, regardless of where they come from. For Achinese as well, you can see a similar pattern where agreements on Achinese verbs is very closely tied with initiators. But crucially, you can't get agreement with unaccusatives like fall in Achinese. And that's because that argument is not generated as the specifier of the agreeing head. And as you've all seen, Uab Meto verbs do not care where the argument originates. It'll just agree with the highest one. Okay. I'll also point out that you can actually even have agreement with accusatives in Uab Meto under the right circumstances with non-initial verbs. Okay. So then I will go ahead and say that there also isn't a good argument for a feature sharing analysis in Uab Meto, where like say you have multiple elements that agree. So maybe you'd want to share stuff, but that doesn't quite work either. And the primary evidence for that is that each different verb seems to probe independently. And you can often have multiple verbs in a series that agree with different things. Okay, so in conclusion, Uab Meto broadens our understanding of the typology of agreement. While previous work has shown that absolute preference agreement can arise from a low phi probe on little v or a high phi probe on t with case discrimination, nominative preference agreement has been linked to a high phi probe on t. Uab Meto shows that nominative preference agreement can also be low. And more broadly, Uab Meto affirms the prediction of minimalism and distributed morphology that a phi probe doesn't need to be on a particular head at a particular height in the clause. Nominative preference can be obtained with a phi probe anywhere above the merged side of external arguments. Nothing requires that phi probes be located on particular heads. What really matters is DP eligibility and close C command. Relatedly, Uab Meto shows that subject agreement and case assignment don't necessarily go hand in hand. As I very briefly showed you, Uab Meto verbs can agree with nominative or accusative DPs, suggesting that agar doesn't assign case to the DP it agrees with. And to account for the distribution of agreement, the phi probe has to be below T, but to derive the correct surface order, the highest DP needs to move to the left of negation TAM markers, presumably to spec TP. Perhaps T drives this movement, and perhaps T assigns nominative case to this DP, but it's not simultaneously agreeing with it. Okay, so those are just a few takeaways from this talk, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tyler. So we have 6 minutes for questions.
Sorry.
And so again, you can either raise your hand or put your question into the chat. Oh, hold on. Dan Brodkin.
Okay. Hi, Tyler. Thanks for the great talk.
Hey, Dan.
Well, I have a question about the analysis of the things called middle field auxiliaries here, and especially bisa. I wonder what you think about an analysis where all of these are just like embedding verbs, like they're all V's and they have their subject to subject raising, you know, like Ross's old analysis of can. Like, because the categorical analysis of bisa as a verb or auxiliary seems far from clear to me in Indonesian. And so I wonder what would happen to your account if we treated all of these things, or how we might understand whether these things really are embedding verbs or, real middle field heads.
Okay, so basically you're wondering why not just call bisa like a big V head or something that then happens to like select for like a verb phrase complement or something. I am not necessarily sure I have a good argument against that. I mean, the primary thing that I started out by using to distinguish lexical V's versus not lexical V's was, do they take agreement or not? In order to show that bisa was higher than these other things, I did the ellipsis test, because presumably if you can elide something after it, shows the thing that can license the ellipsis is higher. But if you were to analyze bisa as a big V, are you wondering then like how I would explain like the lack of agreement on it or something like that? Or
I'm wondering what would happen to the claim that agreement is not in T.
I think if you analyze bisa as, at least bisa specifically as a big V, I don't think it would actually be problematic for that claim, because remember bisa is like, I've argued, is like lower than all the rest of them. And that's because of the fact that it's the one that occurs inside of negation along with the verbal complex stuff. So I think in that case, you would still say, well, these things don't agree. So you might still want to say that agreement is lower than these ones, idealis, must, and will, roughly, and also it's lower than negation. If you were to argue that these things are verbs, I think that's when my analysis would start having trouble handling that. But bisa specifically, I don't think is a huge problem. In fact, the native version of bisa in Uab Meto may actually show agreement, which may warrant a different analysis for that one, or maybe I need to rethink some things. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up? What happens with nonverbal predicates, like I am here, or like I'm a dog?
Nonverbal predicates do not agree. So like, if you want to say like I am a dog, actually Tamisha probably knows more about this. You say like I dog me, awasukau, something like that, and there's no agreement on it. Why that is, I've just assumed that there's like some sort of silent verbal thing in the structure, or maybe you're literally just linking two nominals together somehow. But more to your point, if you say something like, I don't know, he is green, you just say like he green, in matel, and there's also no agreement on that. So I think that makes an argument for the aggr P being particularly associated with verbal complexes, and maybe it needs to select for the whole voice P and related stuff, and maybe with adjectives and with nouns that's simply lacking, and therefore you can't have the aggr selecting for the kind of complement that it wants. At least that would be my guess.
Henderson has a question.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. I was wondering if you have any thoughts regarding, so you have this aggr P projection, and it's appearing right outside where the external argument is noted. Do you have any thoughts about, do you think that that's kind of, there's something to that, or do you think that we might find other languages where aggr P appears slightly higher, maybe still below T, but sort of in other intermediate positions?
Well, I think one of the takeaways of my analysis, if you think that this is an unusual pattern, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. If this turns out to be an unusual pattern, then maybe you would expect that you could have phi probes wherever you want, and then in theory, it could show up on whatever head you want in whatever range. And I don't think there's anything special about where I put it. I mean, the whole reason I even have an aggr P in the first place is because I couldn't find a head to put it on. And I just knew that it needed to be at pretty much this height. But I wouldn't be that surprised if you found that, okay, yeah, so we know that heads this kind of thing can be on T. I don't know, maybe there's like, you could find a language with an auxiliary or two that shows agreement and not other things. We know that phi probes can be on voice and little v. Maybe there's some other stuff in the middle field here that I haven't thought about, but presumably could exist there, like aspect heads or something. I guess maybe that's a bit unsatisfying as a theory, but I think I'm opening the door to that maybe being a possibility.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tyler.